Welcome to day 17 of 100 days of VBA. Now, yesterday we started looking at loops with the for next loop, and today we're going to look at the for each loop. Now, the for each loop is different to the for next loop in that instead of just looping through a statement a certain number of times, we're actually going to loop through a range of cells by specifying which range we'll loop through, and then performing actions on those cells. So let's get started. We'll start by defining our function, as always, using sub and then end sub. And now we're going to write our for each loop. So it starts obviously for, but this time then we have each. And now we're going to declare our variable name. So where we had x yesterday, we're going to have RNG, short for range, today. And we're going to use the keyword in, and then we're going to define the range we want to loop through. So that's going to be application.ActiveSheet.range, and we're going to start with A1 to A5. And we end our for loop in the same way that we did for the for next loop, with a next function at the end, or a next statement at the end, sorry. Which means every time we get to the next, we move to the next cell in our range. Now, the RNG variable, instead of being a number like it was yesterday, is actually representative of a cell. So we can say for each range, range.value equals range.value plus 1. And now if we run that, we're going to loop through cells A1 to A5, where we currently have the numbers 1 to 5, and add 1 to each of those numbers. There we go. So now it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we don't need to limit ourselves to one column either. We can change that range from A1 to C5 as well. And this time it's going to loop through all of these cells and add 1 to all of them. There we are. And it's important to note, in this case, it goes row by row. So it does A1, B1, C1, A2, B2, C2, etc., etc. And we can also write conditional statements in here as well. So let's say if each value is greater than 5, then range.value equals range.value times 10. So again, we're going to loop through this whole range of cells, but we're going to check first if the value is greater than 5, and only then multiply it by 10. So there we go, every number greater than 5 is multiplied by 10. Now, we can also break out of our for each loop in the same way that we could break out of our for next loop. So we're going to use, again, an if statement. This time, we're going to go back to our isNumeric function, if you remember that from the session on new mathematical functions a couple of weeks ago. So again, if numeric, and we're going to use our value equals false, so i.e. we found a text value, not a number value. Then, now first, we're going to use a new function called messagebox, and this is going to give a little pop-up to whoever runs our function, and we're going to say cell, and we're going to use ampersands, remember, to combine our text and variables. And we can use the range variable again there, and this time say address, which gives us the cell reference that we're currently working with. And we'll just say contains text. And we'll also say exit for to break out of our loop. And of course, then we also need to end our if. So let's try that. So this time it will just do nothing because it will just loop through the whole set of cells. None of them are text values. So let's say if we don't find that text value, let's make that false, we'll still do our sum. So let's say range.value equals 0. Let's set it back to 0. And now before we run it, let's set this cell to some text data instead of our number. And let's run our function and see what happens. So there we go, we've got to B3 and it says cell B3 contains text. That's the alert we set up, so that's our message box. And you can see we've looped through the first row, the second row, and the first column of the third row and switched those back to 0. But then we've got to our text value. The isNumeric function has returned false, so we're going to run this code. First we ran our message box, which popped up, and then we broke out of our for loop, so we didn't set any more values to 0. So there we go. Now we've done the for next loop and a for each loop.